podcast brought to you by the Triad Network. This podcast is designed to share trending topics occurring within the world and our communities and bring them a behavioral and mental health perspective.
Welcome to Behavior Health Today. I'm Dr. Graham Taylor, and today I'm joined by Dr. Shaana Berman. Shauna is a board-certified behavior analyst with over 20 years of experience working directly with children who have autism and other conditions that impact behavior and learning. She specializes in early childhood special education, applied behavioral analysis in home, school and community settings, developmental assessment, curriculum design, IEPs, and training teachers to deliver effective instructions to diverse populations of students. Shauna did her undergraduate work in both psychology and biological anthropology at UCLA, received her master's degree and teaching credentials in early childhood special education at CSU Dominguez Hills, and earned her doctoral degree in educational leadership with an emphasis in educational psychology at USC. Her current focus area is in cognitive behavioral training and developing continuing education content for teachers, behavior analysts, and for parents. Our focus today on our podcast is cultural competence and challenges within the school system. Shauna, it's really nice to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
That's great. Well, hey, you've got a great range in your educational instruction and experience. Tell us just a wee bit about your path and how you chose this life in early childhood special education and autism.
Well, it's interesting because I feel like the career just sort of found me, not the other way around. I was attending UCLA and I took an undergraduate class with Dr. Ivar Lovas, who, is the father of our applied behavioral analysis work and really was kind of a springboard for the rest of my career. So I was working with a child at home. I got to take a class with Dr. Lovas, who was absolutely wonderful and hilarious. And it just felt like the right fit. I ended up teaching in an early childhood special ed classroom after that as a teacher and doing assessments with kids as they were coming into the school system at age 3. And then at some point, I got yanked out of the classroom and pulled into the program specialist seat up at the district office to help out there with program design and teacher training and IEPs and compliance and things like that. And we did have a very large, diverse school district. So there were many different types of cultures. There were stratification in terms of the socioeconomic status of our population of students. And I do feel like, wow, when you read that, my goodness, I feel like I should be very, very old with all of that work that I've done, right? But it's given me a really nice comprehensive perspective about young children and family concerns as they're coming into the school district environment, which is very different than the applied behavioral analysis at home environment. And then transitioning out as young adults and looking at what kind of programs are available. There's not very many summer programs for kids. With autism and other disabilities seem to be very limited. If we're not dealing with something like this virus, we would typically be talking to parents right now about what options are for summer now that we're not going to be in school so that we can keep things, consistent in terms of their programming. And a lot of times if I found something, it was not affordable to all the families in our district. It wasn't feasible for them to get there during the day. They had, other commitments like work and other kids and things like that. So definitely could see some differences there in terms of who was accessing those services and who even knew about those services.
Shauna, what school districts were you working in?
I was with Torrance Unified School District, which is LA Unified adjacent, basically. It's a very large school district, lots of kids, and we were the only early childhood special education site in the entire district. So every child from every part of the district that needed an assessment would come to our site, which was a California demonstration site for exemplary programs called Launch Preschool. And I received very, very comprehensive training there in working with OTs and speech and language pathologists, physical therapists, and the behavior team as well, and other teachers and aides. So I got to see kind of how different it was in a school setting versus a home setting versus a community setting. And I also got to interact with all kinds of different families because, again, we were the only place that the kids in our district that qualified for an IEP would go. They would go to Launch. So I got to see how, behavioral intervention could help in more than just the classroom setting, I could help the speech and language pathologist, for example, implement her goals, because I could get that child to sit down and participate, whereas she spent her whole session, chasing him around the room and cleaning up things that he was throwing, things like that.
Yeah.
So it was very, very nice and well-rounded. And I feel like that's kind of given me a unique perspective on treatment.
It's quite an area with quite a need. I grew up in Pasadena, not too far outside of LA. And I was part of busing back in the 70s when I was going to school.
Oh, wow.
And I know that they've got just a wonderful opportunity for a diverse set of needs being worked with, experienced, learned from. Give us just a brief history on special education within the school system and kind of how it got started. And then if you would, take us into some of the challenges being experienced with regards to race and socioeconomic status within special education that you've seen.
Sure. Well, special education was sort of born out of the civil rights movement. So, we were moving towards desegregating and based on race and et cetera. Parents of kids with disabilities were saying, well, what about our kids? And don't they have the right to an equitable education as well? So prior to that, kids with disabilities, severe disabilities in particular, were either kept at home or sent to institutions. So there was no place for them in the education system until the special education concept was born and some federal laws were passed. So the main one was the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which became what we now refer to as IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And that's been amended many times, but it includes many protections for parents and for students in terms of how they are assessed and how states will receive funding and schools will receive funding for certain programs. And again, I have seen stratification in that area too, in terms of, certain parts of the school district I worked at, for example, some people didn't know about the program. Some people didn't know that it was even a concern that their child wasn't talking at age 4 because they didn't have health insurance.
They didn't know.
And they didn't have a regular doctor. So I was seeing things like that. And we've made a lot of progress. If you look at the trajectory of laws and such, and policies and things like litigation, especially in the special education area where I'm at, is just, has really made things move along in terms of equitable access to education for kids with disabilities. But there's still some disparities that we see, and we see that in public education and in special education. And we also see that in home private services as well, and agency services, in terms of who knows about it, who trusts it, who knows how to get it, who knows how to pay for it or have it funded.
Right. So part of it is just a knowing and a recognition this is in place. You're talking about the Individuals with Disabilities Act idea. Give us just a brief kind of naming of each one of those parts, if you would, and kind of just a brief summary of its principles, so we know that there's what the laws are that do govern this, that we can work within once we know what they are.
Absolutely. It was sort of a surprise to me that people didn't all know about this. And when I first started in the field, I didn't know about this.
Yeah.
This was actually not even covered that much in my teacher training program. So I think that, somewhere along the lines of this discussion, I think that needs to be touched on too, is, well, where do we start? How do we impact the system, and where do we create change? And it would be in those training programs and in those credentialing programs, so that we do all have an understanding of what this law is and what the 6 primary principles are. The first one is FAPE. So this is an acronym. There's so many acronyms in special education, but FAPE is just another one, but that stands for Free and Appropriate Public Education. So that principle is designed to ensure that all kids with disabilities do have access to a free and appropriate public education that is designed to meet their unique needs. So it's an individualized program, not a cookie cutter, and that's important to note too.
You're talking about oftentimes there's a lack of awareness. Let's create a little bit here on our show, just for people to have a sense of what they could be plugging into and kind of be, benefiting from.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Absolutely. And I will say also that a lot of behavior analysts do work in the school setting and sometimes
Yeah.
are funded by the school district for part of the program for the child. Sometimes they're privately funded, sometimes both. But once anyone participates in that IEP meeting and signs that document, that IEP, which is an individualized education plan developed for a student with a disability based on an assessment, once you sign your name to that, you're signing a legal document.
That's right.
And there are requirements that you must follow. And I found that not everybody understands this either. And things must be done a certain way. For example, I'll just review the 6 principles and then I can touch on them briefly. But I mentioned FAPE. There's also the principle designed to ensure that there are appropriate evaluations. And the disability must impact learning. So when we evaluate, we want to be using evidence-based practices, and we want to be able to measure those things appropriately and specifically. And we want to make decisions based on that assessment. So the assessment needs to be valid and measurable and based on data. The word appropriate is sometimes where we get into some trouble there, because that's a subjective word, and appropriate could mean different things for different types.
But the idea is a good one,
students.
though. But the idea is a good one. We're talking about probably, valid and reliable assessment to really help understand somebody and what their needs may be, so we can kind of develop a plan around that. And that maybe leads into the individualized education program, the IEPs you're talking about.
Yes. And again, I mentioned that before. It's a legal document written to make sure that the student is receiving an individualized program based on their unique needs. We have assessed using a highly qualified multidisciplinary team of individuals, depending on what those needs may be. We must assess in all areas of suspected disability. So I've seen a situation where a student came in that clearly did have signs of autism, was not diagnosed, was close to 4 years old, and there were behavioral issues noted in the assessment, but the behavioral assessment was not completed in time for the student to attend school, and it became a litigated case because of that. So if we suspect there's a behavioral issue or there's a behavior impacting learning and that child qualifies for an IEP, we have to assess in that area and write goals too. And then we would place the student in the LRE. So there's another acronym, which stands for the least restrictive environment. And that means that we try to place kids in a program or a classroom that is as close to general education as possible, if not general education with supports and services. But again, there's another area where we can run into some issues, because it's sort of like there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. And, who's directing what? And this is my classroom and I'm not changing this. Or sometimes we have very receptive people and people can collaborate, which is a big requirement of all of this. Is we need a lot of open and honest collaboration and communication with the family too. So that's the LRE.
So you mentioned family as well being a part of this part.
Yes, I sure did. And that's actually another principle. So parental participation. And that means that the school has to ensure that the parents are actively involved as members of the IEP team. So they're not just passively sitting there listening to results and recommendations and signing off on it. Unfortunately, that requires some expertise and some research on the part of the parents and some trust on the part of the parents as well. And oftentimes, if there's conflict in the very beginning or disagreements or something like that, you can have that impact how much the parent is going to participate, how much they trust the process, how likely they are to pursue their due process rights, beyond the assessment, if they even allow the assessment. I run into some families that did not want, for example, their male child labeled as anything. And there was sort of a shame element to that as well for that family. Definitely based on culture, that if there's something wrong with my son, it's sort of my fault as the mother kind of a thing. So we definitely have different levels of participation or even willingness to participate in this from different families. And then the last part is procedural safeguards, which I mentioned, due process rights. So we must provide parents with a statement of their rights at every IEP. We're also supposed to explain them. But in my experience, that has never happened. Somebody will say, would you like me to explain these? No, I've received these 50 times. I don't need them. But did you really read and understand it? Because you have a lot of protections in that piece as well, all part of IDEA.
Yeah. You know what I like
Yeah.
about this? There are legal safeguards for our children, giving them opportunities to really have the education that we really want as a nation for them to receive. There are a lot of great safeguards and some frameworks in this where they can really benefit. But like you're saying, a lot of times it's just not recognized and known and what they can be fitting into. I'm familiar with the IEP process, and it really is a wonderful agenda of things that children get to receive, not to give them a leg up or something that's, unfair. It's equaling the playing field for them. So their potential gets to be fully realized and manifest in their learning opportunities. And it really allows them to, achieve those things that they're designed to achieve.
Right. Yeah, it definitely levels the playing field, and it's definitely not something extra. And as a person involved in special education for a long time, my goal is always to get the child out of special education.
Absolutely.
And again, in my experience, that's very hard to do. Once you're placed in special education, the gap can get bigger and bigger and bigger between what you're supposed to be doing and what you are doing.
Yeah.
And oftentimes we have a lot of wonderful staff in a lot of places, but we also have some schools and some communities that do not have trained staff, do not have trained paraeducators or assistants in the classroom, and they're working with the kids that have the most needs in the entire district, and they have the least amount of training and education. That's an issue as well. But we always want to move, we keep the child in general ed with supports and services wherever possible. But if we can't implement the goals that we've written based on the assessment we've done, if we can't implement them effectively in the general education environment, then yes, some kids need more specialized classrooms or supports or accommodations or behavioral support in the classroom, et cetera. It's definitely been, I've seen a lot of things and I've seen a lot of situations. And, as somebody who works for the school district as well, there's certain things that I can and can't do, because when I say something as a school district employee, I'm representing the school district, and they are also required to follow these mandates and things like that. So if I'm not trained and I say something inappropriate, or I write a goal that's not measurable, or I fail to incorporate the parents' values and things like that and priorities into the IEP, that becomes a legal issue.
We'll be right back after word from our sponsor.
Behavioral and mental health professionals provide critical support to our communities in a time when our communities need it more than ever. But they need support too, to continue their education, to connect with colleagues, and to advance their career. And so we've launched Triad, the hub for behavioral and mental health professionals. At Triad, you'll find education, community, and career resources for both current and aspiring behavioral and mental health professionals, all curated specifically for you and all for free. Visit us at hellotriad.com/BHT to register for your free professional account. Again, that's hellotriad.com/BHT. Come join the community today.
Yes, it does. I want to talk a little bit later in our show about that idea of awarenesses that we can have when things are being assessed and, written and kind of agendized for folks. But I do know that racial and socioeconomic disparities do exist in regular as well as in special education. And I know we can see these disparities kind of come up in our test scores, how things are assessed in terms of academic achievement, or the percentages of one repeating a grade, or graduation rates, or dropout rates, or even, disciplinary markers, behavior markers. But I know that these are just kind of the tip of the iceberg. And I'd, again, like to talk about those in just more of in a minute. But what are some of the areas for us to consider in terms of disability rights, maybe in some special education, how those come together?
Okay, if we look at the special education process, so states are required actually to do something called child find, which means that the school districts are responsible for finding kids with disabilities and assessing them and making sure that they are receiving the right services by the age of 3, which is when the school district becomes responsible for that child's education. So that in and of itself can be an issue, because how do we find these people, and how do these people that may need to have their child assessed, how do they find the school district? And that has to do a lot with sometimes a concept called cultural capital or social capital, which is a network, that we use. I know how to do this. I knew how to apply to college, for example. I knew I had to write an essay. I knew I had to fill something out. I knew that I could apply for some financial aid online. But there's other people that I know that I've seen actually their children getting close to college age now that are of a different socioeconomic level, that nobody in that community is doing that. So they didn't know how to do that and didn't do part of that and ended up with no money for school, so that find process and that social capital piece or cultural capital piece definitely impacts. Are we finding the kids? When are we finding them? Are parents open and trusting and willing to seek out the services from the school district, which is often a very big divide in terms of what someone is saying to you and what you're understanding about what's going on with your child.
When you talk about that cultural capital like that, I've read some of the things you've done. You refer to it as sometimes creating an educational achievement gap, and that can be a challenging piece. Can you walk us down that a little bit?
Sure. I'd like to say a few more things just about the process first, if I could. Once we have found kids or they have found us as a school district, so from the perspective of the school district assessor or whatnot, they may come in with a diagnosis, they may not. The parent typically is worried that, well, he doesn't listen to me. And, he is loud and he breaks things and he's been kicked out of 3 preschools and he's not talking. And again, maybe they didn't have the resources, the social resources or networks or finances to have a regular doctor or whatever, someone who would refer them for additional assessments while that child is under 3. And so we have that issue too, where we see some disparities in terms of when a child receives a diagnosis, when they're evaluated, when they show up for an assessment, for special education, what kinds of placements, eligibility categories we call it, what are they given? So we've seen some disparities there as well in terms of who is labeled what we used to say MR, which was standard for mentally, retarded, which is a terrible term. We now say cognitively impaired, which I'm not sure how much better that is. Learning differences. I like that. Processing differences. I like that.
That's what they are.
That's what they are.
We all learn a different way. That's right.
Exactly. But we see some kids getting labeled more often than others, being placed in more restrictive settings more often than others. So that's another area where disability rights and special education, kind of intersects. And then the amount or quality of services. So families might not know about the services, but when they are given services, and I have personally witnessed this, families that don't know, they're not in the know, are being referred to, for example, an agency that is brand new and has very little training. And if this other family over here that has a lawyer received services from that particular provider, it would be a due process hearing immediately, and everybody knows that. So they wouldn't recommend that provider to that family. They're going to recommend that provider with the least amount of training to this other family who doesn't know any better. And so that's another place where that has come up in my career that I've seen. And then the next part was the educational achievement gap. So I've said disparity before, and you mentioned educational achievement gap. So that's kind of another thing that came out of the civil rights movement, was like, well, is public education equal and fair? Is it? And so in 1966, they published the Coleman Report, which is a document that showed that there were persistent gaps in academic performance based on race and ethnicity, even when resources were the same. So given the same level of resources for the schools, there were still these gaps in terms of academic performance. And that was termed the educational achievement gap in public education. So public education is supposed to be a vehicle for social mobility, and this report sort of illustrated that maybe it's not really doing that as well as we think it is. And these gaps in terms of academic performance mirror other gaps in society, like there are disparities in who's in jail and who goes to college, who graduates with a diploma, who receives a higher salary than somebody else, and those types of things. So in terms of social mobility, are we achieving that with public education today? And I think the answer is, well, not always.
Not always.
Yeah.
I like that idea that, we're in place educationally to give kids an opportunity to, again, reach what their potentials are and to have that social and economic mobility where they can advance, those things in their life with some level of being equipped. And I know a lot of research kind of goes around some of the racial disparities as well in special education. What are you seeing with some of the disparities, both maybe racially and maybe even socioeconomically taking place that impacts this educational process?
Right. Well, yes, public education, there are disparities based on race in terms of academic performance. So we see that, you mentioned in the beginning of the show, we do see that in test scores.
Yes.
And we do some standardized testing in 4th grade and 8th grade. And there are some persistent gaps there that are race and ethnicity based and socioeconomic status based. So kids in poverty are scoring consistently lower. The idea was that, well, because they're not prepared for school, they don't have money, their families didn't have prenatal care, there's all these things that are going on before they get to school. And that means that they're just not ready and they're not prepared. So they're obviously going to perform lower. My dissertation actually was on high performing, high poverty schools that had a large concentration of students of color attending. So I located some schools, and I had others in my cohort that located some schools that were in high poverty areas. All the kids attending the school were on free and reduced lunch, which means that they are below the poverty line. They qualify for the school to provide meals. So high poverty school, and there were high levels of performance there. Those schools were outperforming all the other schools in the area. And we looked at sort of, why is that?
That really intrigues me. What were maybe the two or three things that you found were explanatory of that?
We found that a school-wide program for, I don't want to say discipline, I don't like that term at all, but a school-wide behavior program, for example. So the whole school follows this same program. Okay. The staff is very collaborative. So 1st grade knows what 2nd grade is doing and vice versa. And there's a continuity there in terms of we are all motivated towards the same goal.
We share the same goal. Yeah.
Yeah, that can come from administration and
usually,
and this is our goal, this is our mission, and
we all kind of have a shared identity and the vision we're here. We're all working towards it. What a great idea!
Absolutely.
Sports teams do that all the time.
Yeah, they sure do.
Businesses do that all the time. Here's our goal for the quarter, or here's our identity as a company or as a sports team, and here's our whatever it may be. So a shared vision, shared kind of enthusiasm, and we're all going in one direction together. That's cool. What else? Right.
And symbols, so symbols of high performance. So on the walls, you're seeing all sorts of student work. And there was at one point a little like a graph, and it said, we want all of our kids to be performing at this level by the end of the year. And here's where we are right now. And here's where we were 6 months ago. And they had like a visual for kids to walk by, and it was all very positive. So a lot of high expectations. We expect that you're going to do it. And another big thing was time on task. So how much time was spent on instruction in those classrooms, and with a behavior program that has consistently been implemented across grade level within the entire school, and everybody's constantly reinforcing it and giving tickets for good behavior, for example, that they can use to do something with that they like. Not as much behavior problems going on in the classroom. Teacher can teach more. But expectations have a lot to do with it as well.
I love that. These things we're talking about, I want to highlight. These are so doable. And we see them all the time. We go into a business and we find out, that was a business that was, 2019 business of the year. Because they got it on the door from the Better Business Bureau, So that's when you work there, that's your identity. Or you're working for a company and you're seeing the lines going up and to the right in terms of our earning potential and what we've done this year. Or you see a sports team with banners in their gym with all the years that they've won certain things. Or I was watching something the other day and I saw in the background of this gym, it says, expect to win.
Yeah.
It's just that identity. So you're talking about a shared vision that the school leaders put together and we all start leaning in the same direction. There's these visuals of achievements, whether they're, the proverbial trophies or, hey, we're here right now, but we want to shoot for here and we can all do it together. Or this time on task where there's an attention around that. These all create an identity for students, doesn't it? And within this school system, it's an identity that says, wait a minute, I can do this. And if I think I can, I know I can. I think it was Ford that said, whether you think you can or you think you can't, either way, you're going to be right.
Yes.
So let's think we can. That's what you're saying here. Let's lean into doing this. It's even, I know we're kind of short on our time, but I want to jump down maybe just a little bit too. You talk about kind of Rosenthal effect, and it has to do with expectations, and it is everything in our schools as parents for ourselves. And this is the way that we can think, isn't it? Talk a little bit about that part.
Absolutely. Well, cultural competence and culturally responsive instruction, there are a lot of terms to refer to diversity at this point, and it goes beyond just knowing what Kwanzaa is or something. You know,
one more
we really want to celebrate, diversity, and we want to see symbols of relatable things, foundational things for students to hook new knowledge onto. And we want to have the expectation that they can do it. And as a special educator myself, it was like, well, and I train teachers to this day, if that child is not following the instruction you give them, it's either that your instruction was not clear or they did not value what you want them to do, i.e. they're not motivated to do it. They're not motivated to do it. And if you expect that someone is going to fail, it kind of creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. And we call that deficit thinking when we apply it to, well, you know, they're not ready, they're poor, you know, whatever it is. And we get lower expectations. And then the teachers actually, they don't spend as much time on instruction with certain students, or they don't give them the complex reasoning tasks. They give them define this term task and moving on. And so that child may believe, well, I can't do it, you know, and now I'm performing at that level, like you said.
You know, when you put it that way too, in order for us to come alongside kids, even come alongside each other, we have to understand, I believe, and I'd love to come back and talk about this sometime more, but it's, you know, cultural competence means that we first understand as leaders or as those in the schools, a sense of who we are and what we bring to those moments so that we can have a clear understanding. Am I bringing any bias, or am I bringing anything that could slant my accurate, valid assessment of what this child has as potential? And sometimes we don't know. We just see it from the outside. We know nothing about them. So if we can understand ourselves, we're more open then to begin to understand and get to know them such that these things can open up and our expectations can say, hey, I wonder if we could get this together and what might we need to do it? And then that expectation, because children, they haven't got a frontal lobe. We don't have that till we're 24, 25 years old, planning, reasoning, judgment, thinking, you know, anticipating consequence. Those things don't come about till later in our lives. So children are so dependent upon what we set as expectations for them. We set the framework. And what you're encouraging here that I love is, what if we set the expectation that we can do this? We just got to find a way or make a way. Let's go do that together as a school, as a classroom, one-on-one with our kids, parents with kids. These are real possibilities, aren't they?
They are. And I'm thinking of another quote. I'm not sure who said it, but it was something along the lines of, the way we talk to children becomes their inner voice.
Absolutely.
And so oftentimes, you know, I'm not aware of my inner voice, but apparently it never stops talking, right? And once you start to pay attention to your own thinking patterns and maybe your own bias or your own expectation or your, well, if then, or because of this, then this, you're predicting the future. And, you know, most of us are not able to do that reliably. And I like how you summed it up by saying, you know, why not set the bar really high and then have the expectation and the cohesion and participation of everyone involved in that school to get everybody there? Because why not? You know, we've seen that the Pygmalion effect, where, you know, low expectations consistently yielded low performance. There was one study I would love to mention quickly where they had two teachers given groups of students that were matched in terms of intelligence and gender, whatnot, very similar groups of students, same ability level. And they told one teacher, lucky you get the high performing students this year. Yay. And the other teacher, oh, you've got the low group this year.
Good luck.
Well, guess what happened? You know, the low group performed really low, much lower than expected. And the high expectation group performed very high, higher than expected. So it's just another example of how expectation influences performance and the way that you think about yourself. And it starts with knowing yourself.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. I think what we get to understand about ourselves and as leaders, as teachers, as mental health professionals, if we can get really clear about my understanding of myself and then how that's going to impact how I view this young boy or this young girl, and how I can come alongside them in a way that really meets what they're doing. So I love what you're saying. Our voice really can help kids know what to expect from their future. And that's either going to be, a positive thing or it's going to be a negative thing. And little do we know it, but we're setting the framework from which they will work for the rest of their lives and see themselves in terms of their own self-meaning. I know we're kind of winding down, but I really appreciate you talking about your dissertation. Thanks for kind of opening that door for us. Because those are all things that are, we've got these great laws, we've got these agendas, we've got these IEPs, all good things, a lot of acronyms driving what we do. But you're talking also about some just inherently possible things in just our own self-awareness. What is our vision? What's our mascot? What drives us? Where do we start and where are we now? And where do we want to go in terms of things that can be measured? And this idea that, we're going to be really conscious about the time we put on task. And I appreciate you sharing those parts with us here. As we come to kind of a close in our time today, if you have a word for the teachers that are out there, they're working hard. And there's so much on their plate. They're just not coming in getting to teach, math or science or history or English. They've got so much on their plate, wearing so many hats, from behavioral challenges to things at home to did that kid eat this morning, to what happened in their home last night, and what kind of emotional state are they going to be in. They got 20 to 30 kids in their class having to make individual assessments every day and manage that. So my hat goes off to them. It's a challenging task, and the majority of them are doing a great job. So if you could speak out to these students or teachers rather, and just give them a word, what would you say to them?
Thank you. Thank you for your commitment to your students, because as a former teacher, I know that you take your work home with you every weekend. You're working on IEPs after hours, during your time. The good teachers are definitely doing that. Our special educators that are dedicated and committed to having their students achieve their best human potential. Thank you, because we need that at a time that might be a little bit unsettling for some, but I feel like this is a good time to reevaluate our priorities and how we're structuring our programs, both in public education, special education, and private services too.
I couldn't agree with you more. It's funny, COVID at its very best allowed us to stop. In fact, we were mandated to stop. And it allows us, I think, to have some reflection in a number of ways. I think even reflection on how we do our work and what am I bringing to my work. And maybe in some ways, as we come back into the fall, what we get to kind of look at as educators, as, whatever your work's going to be, but that work that involves interaction with others, what do I want to bring? And what do I want to do? Maybe do a little bit differently. What do I want to turn the volume up on? And maybe what do I need to recognize I need to turn the volume down on?
Right.
And so it's almost like the ability to take two, or kind of a restart in some ways as we come back into the fall.
Yeah.
And how do we want to be conscious and aware of how I want to do it now that I have a chance to kind of start? Very, very rarely do we have a chance to start again, but we kind of do now as things are opening back up, and we get to be maybe more intentional than we were in the past. And so I think that's a great opportunity you're suggesting here. Hey, as we wind down, give us some resources, how we can follow up on you and any other resources you think might be relevant to this topic we're on today.
Well, I'm currently at www.metamindmagic.com.
Nice. All right.
So you mentioned in the beginning, I'm working a lot with cognitive behavioral patterns and limiting thinking patterns and beliefs and how to move beyond those. So I can be found there. I also have a Facebook group called Positive Behavior and Learning, which is, if you search my name, you'll find me. I'm not on social media that much, but I do respond to emails and messages through the website. So
very good. And we're going to put those up on our site as well for those listening in, so they'll have access to it as well. Thanks for sharing them. Well, Shauna, thanks so much for being with us today. It's been great to have you.
Wonderful. And I really enjoyed the discussion. I would love to continue it if you ever want to. I'm interested.
We're going to have you back.
Yeah.
You bet we will. You
Great.
bet we will.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to thank our listeners too for joining in today. And we'll look forward to having you with us next time on Behavioral Health Today.
We appreciate all the support from our community, and if you like our show, one of the best ways you can support it is by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review. Behavioral Health Today is a podcast part of the Tribe Network, all rights reserved.